So good afternoon to everyone who is here with us. We are now in Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, and we have a wonderful opportunity to talk about an institute called Centropa. It works on learning Jewish history in 20th century. So today we have a wonderful guest, Edward Serotta. He is a journalist, photographer, and filmmaker specializing in Jewish life in Central and Eastern Europe. He is the director of the Centropa Institute. So the films that they produce, we can actually discuss the films that they produce today, and also we can talk about the exhibition that is now held in Kiev, and also we will discuss Centropa's projects. So Mr. Edward, greetings in Ukrainian house.
І мені насправді теж цікаво з вами поспілкуватися.
It's very interesting for me to talk with you because I attended one of the Centropa seminars in Ukraine, and so I noticed that it's kind of a different view, a Jewish community in Ukraine, in Europe, and it's also very interesting projects helping Ukrainians, in particular Ukrainian teachers, educators, to kind of think, and get a broader view at these issues, and also look for their own roots. For those who are connected to Jewish community. For our listeners, I'm sure it will be interesting. How would you evaluate Centropa's activities lately? So what are the top 5 achievements of the Institute?
The most important thing that we did was we started in Ukraine in the year 2000, and we worked with Professor Leonid Finberg, an historian here at the university, and we set out to interview elderly Jews. And we, with his coordinator, a woman by the name of Marina Karlstein, and a group of interviewers, they spent 7 years interviewing 264 elderly Jews in, I think it was 9 cities in Kherson, Lviv, Kyiv, Ivano-Frankivsk, Odessa, and of course here in Kyiv as well, in Lviv. The idea was we did not use video in our interviews. Instead, we collected family pictures. We scanned them and we asked people to tell pictures about the people in those pictures. We digitized a total of 3,000 family pictures here in Ukraine, and we created an online searchable database. Now with that database, what we do is then we've been making multimedia films, we've been making exhibitions, we've been creating books, and then what we do is we hold seminars for teachers where we ask the teachers to come up with ideas of how they can use this material with their students. In other words, we don't do frontal. What we do is we sit teachers around the table and we like to brainstorm together because no one knows their students better than a teacher. So that's how we like to work with them.
А оці інтерв'ю, про які ви казали.
Okay, and these interviews that you mentioned, is this project finished, or you still have plans to record somebody else in Ukraine?
The interviews are completely finished, unfortunately. To be honest, we ran out of money. But we did interview 264 people. And what makes these interviews so interesting is that they begin with the stories begin with their childhood from the 1920s and 30s and go up to the day that we interviewed them, which was between 2001 and 2007. So you have all of these fascinating photographs and stories from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, all the way up until 2000. So as an archive, it's extremely important because you see the entire 20th century as told by elderly Jews who grew up in places like Berdichev and Rivne and in other cities.
Ну, далі я теж
Okay, as a historian, I would like to ask you some philosophic questions. Maybe so they could not be answered like one-sidedly. So, the focus. If to speak about historical researchers, and interviewers are kind of those historical researchers, and they have certain formula, but no, when we conduct interview, the main goal is to preserve the memory about community. So in your case, the focus was on the life of a person, particular person in particular community, like to show culture, the history, and that's also about the Holocaust, big time. Maybe some other focus is there.
You have it exactly right. The idea is just we wanted to sit down with each person. And by the way, I should say that this project, the genesis for this project, the seed was born in 1997 when I was in Ukraine for Time magazine. And I was photographing for them and writing a story. And this was an article about restitution payments that could finally be made to Holocaust victims. And my translator was nice enough to take me to the town of Bohuslav. And this was one of the towns where Sholem Aleichem lived. And I met people there, and I noticed they kept showing me pictures, and they wanted to tell me stories. And I was thinking, it's not what I'm here for. But then I said, I have to go back and get that. Unfortunately, we didn't interview in Bohuslav, but we did interview in a lot of other places. But you're right, our approach to history is let every single person tell us exactly what they went through. And everyone in Ukraine, not just Jews, everyone in Ukraine had a very difficult 20th century. Every family suffered from the Holodomor. Every family suffered from the Second World War. It's just that the Jewish citizens of Ukraine suffered even more because the Germans were out to murder them all. And they're the ones who either fought in the Soviet army or they fled into evacuation. In a few cases, their neighbors were actually kind enough and crazy enough to actually save them and put them in their barns or their basements and kept them for the entire war. So, but then also, our stories are about the years after the Second World War. There was the anti-cosmopolitan campaigns where people were deathly afraid to be Jewish. Jewish doctors couldn't get a patient because no one would want to come to them. And that was all the way through the early 50s. Things settled down after that. And we read this in their interviews, but then came the arguments in every family starting at the end of the 1970s. Should we go to Israel? Should we leave? And of course, we all know that once Ukraine became independent in 1991, elderly people had a very difficult time. It was awful because their pensions went to nothing. And if you were Jewish, unlike most Ukrainian families, if you were Jewish, you didn't have a family. They were murdered in the Holocaust. So Jewish families in Ukraine in the 1990s were tiny compared to everyone else, and there was very little of a social network. International organizations came in and they helped some. But what I love today is the fact that when I go and visit elderly Jews here, I was in Chernihiv yesterday visiting Basia Abramovna, who's 87 years old, and when she was in Romanian concentration camps during the Second World War and in German and in ghettos. But when in March of 2022 in Chernihiv, they said, you can leave. She said, I didn't run in 1941 and I'm not running now. And she's still there.
Ну, насправді, кожна історія будь-якої людини є цікавою.
While every story of every person is very interesting. Just recently by accident, I was just going by bus, and some 50-year-old just was sitting near me. Obviously, he didn't experience Second World War, so he was wearing a uniform of Ukrainian army, and he said, I was in the army, and my whole life I was fighting against Russians, and I couldn't understand how it's possible. And he said that he was in Israeli army, in intelligence forces, and in that case, in that way, so the enemy that is obvious for us now was obvious for him that time. So I wanted to ask you about this particular part. So about this after-war attitude, after Second World War attitude to Jews, and you mentioned also cosmopolitanism, company. Yes, there are many materials known by historians. So this topic is, it's I believe that it's worse to make it more public in the world, in Ukraine, because to some extent it was anti-Semitism in USA, in Soviet Union.
A great deal of anti-Semitism. I remember my first time and only time that I went to Moscow. When I was at the airport leaving, there was when you got on the plane, there were a lot of folders and brochures, and I said, "Oh, that should be something interesting." Every single one of them was something against Israel. And I said, why the hell do they care so much about giving passengers on a flight to Frankfurt information about anti-Semitism? It seems so stupid. But then that would be the Russians. The individual histories of Jews in Ukraine is vitally important for every Ukrainian to understand about their country's history. And by the way, it's not only the Jewish history. Every city, every town has Jewish history. They have Ukrainian history. They might have a Tatar history. All of these histories need to be pulled out. We were just very good at focusing on these, and then to ask people to tell us about what it was like at work, at school, and for their children and their grandchildren, because their lives after the war was extremely important.
Ну, я якраз питаю.
Yes, I'm actually asking about this anti-Semitism of Soviet times because, I'm one of those who didn't experience that, due to the age maybe. So obviously, Soviet Union, they treated Jewish, they didn't treat Jewish good for sure. But looking at the general picture in the world, that also brought more light to what is the Moscow now, what is the Russia now. Speaking of pogroms, this is part of the history. And that also, that politics that was widely used in Russia. So this is the question for thinking how this question can be stimulated for researchers.
Every person's individual history is extremely important, and everyone experienced history, what history was done to them. Now, there were, of course, some horrible pogroms in Ukraine between the 1918 to 1921. That was carried out by Ukrainians. And, by the way, if you're in Western Ukraine, it was carried out by Poles. And it was carried out by Russians. They all fought each other, but they were all killing Jews. So we have this chapter that needs to be looked at as well.
Так, погоджуюсь цілком.
Yes, I completely agree with you. Let us get back to Centropa's activities and to the seminars that you conduct for teachers and educators. For our viewers who maybe are not aware of the program of these seminars, what key moments you are trying to make known in these seminars?
What we do is the first step is what we do at Centropa in each country we work in is we collect family stories and make them available online so teachers and students can read them. Second, we then create multimedia films. where we take the stories of the people we interviewed and we use motion graphics and we hire actors to do the readings of them. And then we do projects like create these huge exhibitions. Now, when we do a seminar, we bring the teachers together so that they can brainstorm themselves on how to use the films, how to use the exhibitions, and how to use the online biographies. And we let the teachers figure it out. If you're going to bring a teacher for a weekend to look at Jewish history and you're going to give them a curriculum in a box that you're going to try to train them to use, it won't work. You train a dog, you train a bird, you don't train a teacher. You empower a teacher to use the material and let them brainstorm with each other, because teachers, when a teacher stands before her kids or his kids and they see that the kids are learning and they get excited, they can't wait to meet some other teachers to say, why don't you try this? I tried that. And that's what Centropa does. And one of our newest films, by the way, is shortly after the full-scale invasion began, I went back to Bosnia, and I'd been in Bosnia during the siege of Sarajevo in 1993, 94. And what I did is I brought a camera crew, and there were people in Sarajevo who worked in the synagogue, and they were Muslims, Jews, Serbs, and Croats. And we had each, and that was 30 years ago. Then 6 of them came back to the synagogue 30 years later to talk to Ukrainians and to say, this is what I went through. One woman said, for 4 years they tried to kill me. They failed. I made it, and so will you. So the film was shown in 10 film festivals, and then it won Best Short Documentary in 3 other film festivals. And this is a great film to share with students today. And then we ask the students to comment on it and make their own projects too.
Я насправді теж бачив цей.
Yes, I watched that documentary, that film, and I was impressed. That was last year, and here in Ukraine, we are actually now in that state, and for us, it was very impressive. And despite the fact that I'm very optimistic, believing in the fact that the war will soon end, but in any case, little by little, we are getting this feeling that we are living in this reality for so long that it may stay with us forever. This feeling of danger, of threat, and your film forced me to think how it looks from this side and how it will look like after 30 years, when our war will be over and we will make it through what is important. So speaking of the topic of film, so obviously, you have the new ideas. What if, this our conflict that we're having now would be over? And what if you would come up with the idea to make a film about Ukraine? Who would be the characters, the heroes of your film, similar to Bosnian?
That's a brutally difficult question. I don't meet anybody here I don't really fall in love with. I mean, the people I meet here, I went to Kharkiv. There's the rabbi of Kharkiv who, he had the 30th anniversary of his Jewish school in Kharkiv, and that was on the 23rd of February, 2022. And the next morning, things were a little different. And I said, were you prepared? He said, I didn't have a bottle of water. And the interesting thing is that he and his family, they ran from Ukraine and they went to Israel, and everybody said, oh, we're so glad you're here. We're so glad. And he said, I felt so guilty. I went back to Ukraine immediately. And he's still there. People like this are really worth filming. They're really worth talking about and talking to, as well as so many others that we run into in every city. And there are so many stories that Ukrainians simply don't know about. I am now writing a book about Jewish writers, and I never heard of most of them. You never heard of most of them. But one of them was Rachel Auerbach, who she and her best friend was Devorah Fogel, and they lived in Lviv. And they were writing and making projects about Yiddish culture in Lviv. Auerbach couldn't make a living. She went to Warsaw. She was in the Warsaw Ghetto. She survived the ghetto and wrote about life in the ghetto. Vogel wrote poetry and wrote a Jewish walking tour of Lviv. But Vogel was murdered with her children, with her son and her husband in 1942. But there are some Ukrainian historians now and literary experts, and along with some Americans, who are really bringing back Vogel's memory and her stories. And that's a story that needs to be told too.
Ну, насправді дійсно багато історій, але
Yeah, that's true. There are so many stories, but when our war will be over, please don't forget to make the film, because I will advise our viewers to also watch your film Bosnia Greets Ukraine, because it brings up very unexpected feelings about hope. You know, for us like that, we will be 30 years older, remembering how we were surviving this period. So now about the exhibition that you organize in Kyiv now. So, the Centuries of Ukrainian Jews, Pictures and Stories. What this exhibition brings to those who would attend? Maybe something new and unexpected.
I worked on this exhibition, I think, for 5 months, and it is enormous. The problem with Ukraine was the biggest country we worked in. As I said, 264 people we interviewed, 3,000 photographs, and we didn't just digitize photographs. Every photograph has a story, and trying to choose from 3,000 pictures wasn't easy. So we divided the exhibition into, we made it on big 2-meter wide panels. There's a panel on at school. There's a panel with stories and pictures from on vacation. There's another one at work. And then there's one just on family portraits. And then there are panels on the Holodomor, another one on in evacuation, those Jews who fled to, let's say, Uzbekistan during the war. And then there are several panels on that we call the ones I lost, the family members who were murdered by the Germans, the Romanians, and others. And all of this is in the exhibition, and it took a long time to figure out which ones to choose and how to design it. There's a second part to the exhibition, and the second part is I have been coming regularly to Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. I've now spent 29 weeks here, and there are panels based on stories of people that I met. There's a family I knew from Mariupol. The great-grandmother was hiding from the Nazis in 1941 to 42 and 43, the entire war. She was hidden by families and hidden in a cave. Then this war came, and she was hiding from the Russians for 50 days with her daughter and granddaughter. Now, the granddaughter, Ina Zatoloka, her son, Mark, was serving with the Azovstal. And he was in Azovstal for 83 days before they had to give up, and he was sent to a prison, a Russian prison. But they did a prisoner exchange in, I think, September or November 2022, and he got out. The family, they wanted to wait for him. A friend came all the way from Kyiv, and after they were hiding for 50 days in a basement, they were saved. Now, the great-grandmother is gone, but Mark is now working for the military. I don't think I should say what kind, in what way, but he's working for the military, and he came to the exhibition with his grandmother, and that was nice. Now, other stories in the exhibition are about Maxim Levin. Maxim Levin, who everyone knows, was someone who freelanced as a photographer. Max was full of energy and great ideas. He did a project on autistic children. He had a project to help divorced fathers stay more in touch with their children. And he was freelancing for us and photographing for us. He made drone footage for us in Chernivtsi at the Jewish cemetery, and he photographed our conferences for teachers. We even sent him to Mannheim to work at a seminar there. When this full-scale invasion started, Max went right to the front. And at Centropa, we all got together so we could send him some money to keep him going while he was selling his art, his photographs. As we know, on the 13th of March, he was murdered. And then in August of 2022, I went to visit his mother, Valentina Levina, who lives in Boyarka. And at this exhibition opening, she came to the opening. We were very touched by that.
Ну так, це все про уже сучасний біль, звичайно.
Yes, this is about the pain now. It's interesting that you mentioned there is a part dedicated to Holodomor. You know, for me, I think that these two topics are not always cross, you know, about genocide and Holodomor. So often they are different, but you combine them in the exhibition, right?
It's extremely important to show what happened in the Holodomor. It happened to every Ukrainian. What was it? Something that the historians still are debating it, but it's between 3.5 to 4.5 million Ukrainians of every religion starved to death. So we interviewed 264 Jews and those who were in Ukraine at the time. Of course, they had stories to tell, and of course, we put that in the exhibition. It's part of history.
А ви кажете, що у
And you mentioned that in the exhibition is just a part of the pictures, but speaking of all the pictures that you were able to collect in the process of interviewing, so you mentioned that you have certain archives, certain database. How to find it, you know, for those who do not know about your website?
It's on, you can type in, at least in English, Centropa, the easiest thing to type in, Centropa Ukraine. And you will find it. You'll also find in Ukrainian, you'll even find a podcast series that we made. And it has 13 very short episodes. You can hear actors reading stories from Sholem Aleichem. You can hear another actor reading something from Vasily Grossman, who wrote an article in 1943 called Ukraine Without Jews. And in this podcast series, we go around Ukraine and meet people in Berdichev and Lviv and other places.
Зрозуміло. І є ще два такі.
Okay, thank you. And I have two more questions, maybe closer to kind of philosophic questions. That, you know, just recently in Bundestag, so there was a Hitler survivor. They shared that Hitler was trying to kill me for being Jew, and Putin is trying to kill me for being Ukrainian. For you, as for a person who works with this issue, talking with many people, so with many people who survived, many people who fought and keep fighting. So until 2022, was there any understanding that something similar can be said?
Man, I think his name was something like Natan Finkelstein or something like this from Odessa.
Я пам'ятаю, що він з Одеси, так, це точно так.
And I read that what he said, you know, Hitler wanted to kill me for being a Jew and Putin wants to kill me for being a Ukrainian. I don't think you could have a better summary. It's very short and it's exactly correct. You as a writer and a photographer, you're always looking for that one little perfect line, and that's, I think, the most important line that we could have. I'd like to know more about him. If I don't know if he's still living in Odessa, but if he is, I'm going to go see him.
Так, але тут ще питання в тому, що зрозуміло, що це не можна говорити про повторення історії.
Yes, but I mean, I understand that we cannot speak about kind of that the history repeats itself, that's something different that is happening between Russia and Ukraine now. But just the fact that some state makes genocide their goal, their task, it's terrible that these things are happening in this century. So now I would like to hear your thoughts. What do you think about this process? What we were able to prevent, learning from genocide, and from Nazi Germany. All this is the reality that could not be stopped and prevented.
Maybe I'm a little more pessimistic than you are. On the subject of Ukraine, I am optimistic. I know what Ukrainians have accomplished since 2022 is nothing less than a miracle. And every military expert in the world is incredibly impressed with what Ukrainians have done. I am impressed with Ukrainians because I love being here, because you get to watch an entire society defining itself and redefining itself. We're on Krещатик. You walk on Krещатик, and what's the biggest thing on Krещatик? Bookstore after bookstore after bookstore. Where did these bookstores come from? In every town and village, everybody wants to have a bookstore, and people are reading about everything. I think I read that one of the biggest selling books last year was a book on hippies in Lviv in the 1970s. So people are learning about themselves. Now, in regards to how can we stop genocide, we can't. Man has been killing each other forever. It's not going to stop. What we can do is protect ourselves better and create military alliances like NATO and political organizations like the European Union. Since there's been NATO and since there's been the European Union, there's been very, very, very little fighting in these countries. No one expected a crazy man like Vladimir Putin to simply decide that Ukraine should not exist. But that is what he's decided, and he sent his orcs, his soldiers, to murder people here, and it's completely crazy. Europeans have to wake up and be much stronger. They have to create much stronger defense industries. They need to be able to make their own artillery shells in everywhere from Luxembourg to Spain to Italy and to Greece. All of this they need to do because they need to protect themselves. The Poles are doing, I think, one of the better jobs. All of the three Baltics are very strongly pro-Ukrainian for a very simple reason. They don't want the Russians either. We're not going to solve people killing each other, but we can strengthen ourselves, and that's what the Ukrainians are doing.
Але, знаєте, така теза, вона трохи...
Yes, but such thesis is a little bit disappointing for historians because, the research of historical events made for the purpose kind of not to repeat it, not just to know that such things happen, but for such things not to be repeated in the future. So, and it's interesting what you think, how, like, if maybe studios could be transformed, connected to the Holocaust in the future, because, there was also directed at non-repeating, right?
As the Holocaust historian Yehuda Bauer, who was born in Prague and he died in Israel at the age of 94, he was rather pessimistic about this. He said, if it happened once, it can happen again. Mm-hmm. What the Germans taught us is that you could actually create machinery, massive factories, just for murdering people. Mm-hmm. This had not been done before. There'd always been slaughtering of people over the centuries and genocide, but never on this level, never on this scale. So it is at least important that we understand it, that we study it, so that we can try to protect from it. We won't be completely successful, but as I said, to me it's more important to make our country strong so that when you do have a crazy man who is trying to murder your society, that you can stand up against him.
Так.
Yes, we have to agree. Unfortunately, well, despite the fact that we all want to live in peace without enemies around, but in this world, So speaking of Ukraine as a state and Ukrainians and nations, one more question that I wanted to ask you, as a person who comes to Ukraine often, but from the other side, you can also, you also hear like some discussions outside. That's the topic of Babi Yar. Maybe a few years ago you heard that before the war that was a concept about like how it needs to be demonstrated, something that is connected to Nazi, all the deeds, and that caused all the serious discussion in Ukraine that maybe it's not worth it, maybe it's not possible. You have been there. What is your attitude towards this place from your point of view? How it needs to maybe be transformed into something else? I mean, maybe in the context of like museum, exposition.
The short answer is the Babin Yar Living History Center that's part of the Ukrainian government should hire me, and I'll fix it. That's not completely serious. The International Holocaust Babin Yar organization that was funded by many people who were born in Ukraine but now live in Russia, they created several installations at Babin Yar. Personally, I don't like them. I believe there are ways to tell the story of Ukrainian Jewry, and I really don't think these conceptual art pieces do a very good job. There are ways to do it. I offered advice. I offered a consultation. I was brought here a couple of times, but my ideas were not accepted. I've worked in other museums. I created a permanent exhibition in Krakow at the Galicia Jewish Museum, and the thing I'm most proud of is the exhibition that is at Babin Yar right now. Now, this is a temporary exhibition, but I am going to work with the political leadership and the historians to see if there are ways that we can turn that into a permanent exhibition, or at least a semi-permanent exhibition. And I'm going to work very hard at that, because I think we can tell the story of Babin Yar in ways that Ukrainians will understand, and so will the foreign guests who come here, and they will be coming.
Але якщо казати про
But if to speak about the foundation of your idea and to compare if I understood right, to compare with something that was suggested in our before the war period, so that was supposed to be the creation of that horrifying things that were following Jewish people at different levels, different stages of Holocaust, and there was also a question who is going to do it, and many people didn't like it. So what value you wanted to suggest in this exhibition, or I don't even know how to call it, like museum complex or something like that?
Once again, my answer always is going to be they should hire me.
Я думаю, це буде складновато
Well, I believe it will be a little bit more difficult to hire Ukrainian, even due to the level of salaries.
I can find money outside of Ukraine. Ukraine has a lot of fans right now, a lot of people who believe in it. People are incredibly impressed with the way that Ukrainians have been learning about the Holocaust, learning about their Jewish history. Many people in the West always said that Ukrainians were bad people, that Ukrainians were worse than the Nazis. There was a lot of that. And then people just didn't know what to think anymore when 73% of Ukrainians voted for a Jew to be their president. Now, that never happened in England. That never happened in the United States or Canada. And people had to start to rethink their views of Ukraine. And now that there is so much interest by teachers, when we do a seminar in Ukraine, we have hundreds of teachers who want to come. There is such an interest because Ukrainians are redefining themselves, and part of their redefinition of themselves is learning about their Jewish history, the Jewish heritage of their towns and cities, just as it is their Tatar and Ukrainian and every other kind. But this is very important. And I work with foundations that I'm sure would be happy to help come up with the sponsorship for this kind of thing, because I want this to work. I really encourage people here in Kyiv to go to the exhibition. It will be there for about a month. It's the Living History Center at Babyn Yar, and then it's going to travel. We already have requests from, I think, 19 different cities that came in the last few days. They want it in Chernihiv, they want it in Kharkiv, they want it in Lviv, in 2 different universities in Lviv, and in Ivano-Frankivsk, in Vinnytsia, et cetera, et cetera. And of course it will go to Odessa. So to me, we can all relate to a huge exhibition that tells us the 20th century of Ukraine through its Jewish stories and pictures. I can make that happen.
Тобто, я так зрозумів, що мова все ж таки про позитивний наратив.
So, as far as I understand, we talk about positive narrative, about showing this wide, diversity, something that was lost, but not to shock visitors of the exhibition, how it often happens, even in Polish museums, right? Somebody who visited Auschwitz, for them it's very difficult to transfer all those emotions, but in your case, it's more about value of life, right?
You put me on the spot. Auschwitz is Auschwitz. This is the epicenter of evil. This is where over 1.5 million Jews, specifically Jews, were murdered. Babyn Yar is different. Babyn Yar is a place that can be Auschwitz should not be a place where you learn about life. You should learn about the mass murder that took place there. Babyn Yar is a giant park, and there are ways to incorporate. To me, it's a great place to set up projects and exhibitions where you would learn about the entire 20th century of Ukrainian Jewry. And that can be done. And there were terrible things that happened. We interviewed people who described pogroms in Western Ukraine during the 1918 to 1921 period. That should also be in there. The Holodomor should also be in there. But so should what happened to Jews who were murdered at Babyn Yar and at Dobritsky Yar and at Sovsenki in Rivne. All of that should be there too. But then so should every other aspect of their lives. You can't just make an exhibition in a place like this that's about death. That just doesn't make sense. These people had lives. We want to show their lives. I want to show how they lived. That makes it all the more poignant, the more awful when we meet these people and realize that they were murdered. We have at least, I guess, maybe 150 photographs of people who never saw 1943. They've been dead since then and murdered. And many of them at Babyn Yar and these other places I mentioned. They should also be in there.
Дякую.
Thank you so much, both for the wonderful conversation and for the ideas that you shared, because we don't know when we will have such opportunity next time. So I would like to ask you about your plans for the maybe next few years, maybe your plans, goals. So in this same direction, speaking of the history and learning and preservation of history about Jewish community, and maybe something else about Ukraine and the war, maybe you'll be able to present in nearest years.
The most important thing that I'm doing is I freelance as a writer for an online Jewish cultural publication in America. It's called Tablet. And if you type in Tablet magazine Serotta, you can find the 12 to 14 articles that I wrote about Ukraine. Now, in 2023, I asked my editor, and I'm still shocked that he said yes. I said, I want to go to different cities in Ukraine and write about one Jewish writer in each city. And of course, I wanted them to pay for it. And they just said, sure, do it. So a lot of these writers, I have to say, have been canceled these days. But nevertheless, looking ahead years from now, after the war and after the victory, I think these writers will be appreciated more again. So I went to, I started in Odessa for Isaac Babel. Then I went to Kyiv by train so I could write about Sholem Aleichem, my favorite. And he's one that will never be canceled because he died in 1916 and he left in 1905. And I also wrote about Katya Petrovskaya. I think she's a wonderful writer, and she lives in Berlin, and she's young today. Then I went to Berdichev to write about Vasily Grossman, then Brody to write about Josef Rolt. Then I went to Drohobych for Bruno Schulz and Rachel Auerbach and Devorah Fogel in Lviv. And then just yesterday I was in Chernihiv because there was a writer, and she just died in 2015, a very young woman. She was from Chernihiv, but she lived in Moscow, and she wrote several novels. Everybody in her novels is Jewish. They all take place in the 1950s. All of them are hysterically funny. She was a great comic writer, but she died of a heart attack in 2015 at the age of 55. Her name is Margarita Hemlin. I'm writing a book about all of these people. This is my great passion right now, and it's about Jewish writers in Ukraine, and that will take me close to a year, I think, to finish.
І ми вас можемо покликати на презентацію.
And then we will be able to invite you to the presentation of this book when approximately?
That's very funny. I have no idea. Actually, the first draft should be ready in about a month, and then we'll go from there.
Добре, ну тоді ми будемо слідкувати за тим, що буде.
Okay, then we'll follow news about this, your book, and maybe we will be able to talk about it because there is a special format. It's called Around the Book. And I'm leading that project, so maybe we will have another opportunity to meet. I would like to thank you for the wonderful, interesting discussion, for the great work that you are doing, including for Ukrainians, because, to get to know about Jewish community and history in Ukraine, that's something that Ukrainians also need, is that big piece of puzzle that is absent in the historical memory, and something that is absent always brings, some kind of lack of understanding. At the end of the day, we don't know who we are, how we lived 10, 50 years ago, or 100 years ago. And the projects by Centropa, I also spread, on a volunteer basis. I spread the information among my colleagues, among teachers, and I saw how actively they were researching the Jewish community history in their town. And that's also about, our own historical memory. It's very important. I would like to remind our listeners that now in the Babi Yar there is a wonderful exhibition that we just discussed. We know how valuable it is, and it's also connected to today. So thank you so much, Mr. Edward, for the wonderful conversation, and thank you all for your attention. See you next time.